There is a particular kind of silence that only exists before catastrophe. Not peace, not calm. Something tighter than that. Something that presses against the ears and makes the chest feel hollow. Arthur James Lyon Fremantle had felt it before, on parade grounds in Gibraltar, on dusty stretches of the Crimean aftermath, in the drawing rooms of men who were about to make decisions that would kill other men. But he had never felt it quite like this. Not in Pennsylvania, not in July, not with 100,000 soldiers converging on a town that nobody had planned to fight over. Fremantle was 28 years old, a lieutenant colonel in Her Majesty's Coldstream Guards. He had been in America since April, making his way through the Confederate South with the particular fascination of a man who understood armies professionally and found this one unlike anything the professional world had prepared him for. He kept a diary, meticulous, dry, laced with the quiet astonishment of someone watching history perform itself in real time. And when the Army of Northern Virginia crossed into Pennsylvania in the last days of July 1863, Fremantle crossed with it, not as a soldier, not as a combatant, but as a witness, an observer attached to the staff of General James Longstreet, riding through the blue-green farmland of a republic at war with itself, watching everything and saying very little. What he recorded over the course of 3 days in early July would become one of the most singular accounts of the Battle of Gettysburg ever written, not because he was a great stylist, not because he understood the American cause better than the Americans did, but because he was outside of it, because he had no skin in the outcome, because he could look at what was happening with the cold, trained eye of a professional soldier from the most powerful empire on earth, and what he saw disturbed him in ways he did not fully have the language to express. This is the story of the first day, July 1st, 1863, the day the battle nobody planned became the battle nobody could stop. Fremantle had arrived at Longstreet's headquarters in the small hours before dawn on July 1st, having ridden hard from Chambersburg. He wrote in his diary that he slept for a few hours in a fence corner, wrapped in his coat, listening to the sound of Confederate soldiers moving through the night. There was something about the way he described that morning, the gray light, the dust already rising off the road, the distant percussion of what might have been artillery or might have been thunder, that captures the essential strangeness of what was about to happen. The Army of Northern Virginia was not supposed to be here. Lee's plan for the Pennsylvania campaign had never been to pin the Union Army in some particular town and fight a pitched engagement on ground he hadn't chosen. The whole point of the invasion was maneuver, threat, disruption. Draw the Federal Army out of Virginia, keep it off balance, maybe find an opportunity to destroy a portion of it in open country. Lee had been extraordinarily clear with his corps commanders. Do not let a piece of this army get caught alone. And then, on the morning of July 1st, Henry Heth asked if he could take his division down the road to Gettysburg to look for shoes. This is the version that has become famous, almost mythological, and like most myths, it contains both truth and distortion. The shoes part is probably not entirely accurate, or at least not the primary motivation. What Heth actually wanted was to probe the town, see what was there, test whatever Federal presence had been reported. He believed he would find militia or a light cavalry screen at most. He was wrong in a way that would reshape the continent. What was actually in front of Heth's division, deployed across McPherson's Ridge west of town, was John Buford. Brigadier General John Buford, commanding 2 brigades of Union cavalry, roughly 2,700 men, armed with breech-loading carbines that could fire far faster than the muzzle-loaders carried by most of the Confederate infantry. Buford was one of those soldiers who existed slightly outside the ordinary calculus of rank and reputation. Hard, quiet, deeply perceptive.
He had ridden out the night before, looked at the terrain around Gettysburg, and understood something that many of the generals on both sides were still in the process of figuring out. Whoever held the high ground south of town, Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, the long ridge running south, would hold an almost unassailable defensive position, and whoever got there first would force the other side to attack uphill. Buford decided that the Union Army was getting there first, regardless of what it cost him. He spread his 2 brigades thin along the ridges west and north of town. He sent a message to his corps commander, John Reynolds, that the enemy was coming in force and that he was going to hold as long as he possibly could. Then he waited for Heth's men to come down the Chambersburg Pike in the morning light, looking for shoes. Fremantle was with Longstreet's corps that morning, well to the rear of where the fighting would begin. He did not witness the opening collision firsthand, the first shots fired near Her Ridge, the skirmish lines probing at each other through the morning mist, the moment when Heth's officers realized they were not dealing with militia. He heard it. He wrote about the sound of artillery rolling back through the hills like something geological, like the landscape itself was grinding. And he began to understand that this was not a probe, this was the beginning of something much larger. What Fremantle grasped that morning and recorded with the understated precision of a man trained to evaluate military situations was that the Army of Northern Virginia was being pulled into an engagement by its own momentum, not by design, not by Lee's careful strategy, by the sheer forward pressure of soldiers who had been marching and winning for 2 years and who, when they met resistance, did what soldiers do when they've been winning for 2 years. They pushed harder. The engagement west of Gettysburg started with Heth's division. It escalated because A.P. Hill, commanding the 3rd Corps, sent more troops forward. It escalated again because John Reynolds arrived with the 1st Corps of the Union Army, galloping ahead of his infantry to look at the situation personally. The impulse Buford had, the impulse to be at the place where the decision is being made. Reynolds looked at what Buford had done, looked at the terrain, and committed his men. He was dead within minutes of giving that order. A bullet took him off his horse near McPherson's Ridge, killing him so quickly that some of the soldiers around him thought he had simply fallen. He was 42 years old and had been offered command of the entire Army of the Potomac the week before, which he declined. He was one of the finest soldiers the Union possessed, and he was gone before 10 o'clock.
His death did not stop the Federal momentum. It may have accelerated it, the way deaths sometimes do at the beginning of a battle, when everyone is still capable of rage and grief, and the particular fury that comes from watching someone you respected get killed while doing exactly what needed to be done. The Iron Brigade, black-hatted Westerners from Wisconsin, Michigan, and Indiana, the toughest infantry formation in the Army of the Potomac, went into McPherson's woods and hit Heth's men with a violence that temporarily shattered the Confederate advance. Heth himself was hit in the head. He survived only because the folded paper stuffed inside his oversized hat absorbed enough of the impact. The woods became a slaughterhouse. Men died in the shadows between the trees at ranges so close they could see each other's faces. Fremantle, riding forward as the morning wore on, was absorbing all of this through the fragmentary intelligence that filtered back from the front, the dispatch riders, the officers with blood on their sleeves, the distant mathematics of artillery fire that any trained soldier learns to read instinctively. And what he was reading was this: the Confederates were winning, but it was costing them. The geometry of the battle shifted around noon, and then shifted catastrophically in the early afternoon.
While Heth's battered division was reforming and two more Confederate divisions were moving up from the west, a separate and equally dangerous development was unfolding north of Gettysburg. Robert Rodes's division of the Second Corps had been marching down from the north and arrived on Oak Hill with a stunning tactical advantage, the flank of the entire Federal First Corps lying open, unaware that a Confederate division was deploying on the high ground above them. At the same time, Jubal Early's division was coming down from the northeast, aimed directly at the thin line of the Union 11th Corps that had rushed forward to cover the northern approach to town. The Union Army was being enveloped. Not by design, Ewell's 2nd Corps and Hill's 3rd Corps were converging from different directions because of the road network, not because Lee had ordered a coordinated pincer movement, but the result was the same. By mid-afternoon, Federal soldiers on two different parts of the battlefield were feeling their flanks collapse simultaneously, and the physics of that situation are brutal. When a line of infantry feels its flank dissolved, the instinct is not to stay and fight. The instinct is to turn and run, because staying means being surrounded, and being surrounded means being killed or captured. The 11th Corps broke first. It was not cowardice. These were the same men who had been routed at Chancellorsville 2 months earlier, and that history meant they were already fighting with something extra to prove, which is never a comfortable mindset for a soldier. But Early's division hit them hard, and Rodes hit the 1st Corps flank, and the whole Federal position north of Gettysburg became untenable in the space of about an hour. The retreat into town became a rout. Soldiers flooded through the streets of Gettysburg, many of them separated from their units, officers trying to stop the flow with shouts and threats and drawn swords, and above it all, the Confederate artillery hammering from Oak Hill and the northern ridges with a relentless mechanical authority.
The town itself became a nightmare. Narrow streets packed with retreating men, Confederate soldiers pressing in from the north and west. The civilians of Gettysburg, those who hadn't fled, watching from behind locked shutters as the two armies collided in their front yards. Men died on porches. Men were captured in gardens. A soldier from Ohio hid in a cellar and listened to the footsteps of an army he had been fighting an hour before march across the floor above his head. And at the southern edge of all this chaos, Cemetery Hill, the high ground Buford had identified the night before, the ridge that everything had been pointing toward all day. The surviving Federal soldiers, broken, bloodied, separated from regiments and brigades, some of them having fought for 6 hours, were streaming up that hill and finding, to their exhausted astonishment, that someone was organizing them. Winfield Hancock had been sent forward by George Meade, the new commander of the Army of the Potomac, who was still trying to understand what was happening 25 miles away. Hancock arrived at Cemetery Hill in the late afternoon with essentially no command authority. He was a corps commander being asked to take charge of soldiers who belonged to other corps, men who didn't technically answer to him, men who were demoralized and frightened and had just watched their army fall apart. He rode up the hill in full uniform, composed, authoritative, projecting the particular kind of stillness that soldiers recognize as the real thing and respond to in ways that are not entirely rational. He started pointing. He started placing regiments. He looked at the terrain and saw exactly what Buford had seen and what Reynolds had died to give the army time to occupy. He sent word back to Meade, "This is where we fight. This is the ground." Fremantle reached a position where he could observe portions of the late afternoon fighting, and what he wrote about it is revealing in a way that his more straightforward tactical observations are not. He commented on the ferocity of the Confederate soldiers, something he had been commenting on since he first joined the Army in Texas in April, the physical toughness and aggressive spirit of men who had been fighting for 2 years with inadequate supplies and inconsistent pay, and a cause that Fremantle, as an officer of the Crown, could not entirely square with the democratic ideals he had been raised to admire in the abstract. He admired them as soldiers.
He found the institution they were fighting to preserve morally repugnant. He held both of these things simultaneously with the discomfort of a man who has been trained to separate military efficiency from political morality, and is finding that separation increasingly difficult to maintain. But there was something else in his diary entries from July 1st that is more interesting than his admiration for Confederate fighting qualities. There was unease. Not expressed directly, Fremantle was too composed, too British, too thoroughly trained in the discipline of observation over emotion, but it was there in the gaps between what he recorded and what he didn't, in the questions he didn't ask about casualties, in the way he described the Confederate officers he admired most, the way he noted their exhaustion, the strain around their eyes, the particular silence that fell over headquarter tents after the dispatches came in. He was watching an army win a day's fighting and pay a price for it that the army could not afford. The Iron Brigade had been almost destroyed. Heth's division had been roughly handled. Rhodes' division, despite its tactical success, had suffered badly from a series of poorly coordinated assaults that an officer named George Doles had to fix almost single-handedly. The Confederates had captured nearly 5,000 prisoners. They had also put somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 of their own men into the casualty ledger, and Lee had not yet fought his main battle. Fremantle understood armies. He understood the difference between winning a tactical engagement and winning a campaign. He understood that the Federal troops now organizing at Cemetery Hill had not been destroyed, they had been pushed back to better ground. And he understood, because he was a professional and because he was watching with the cold clarity of a man with no personal stake in the outcome, that the ground those soldiers were now standing on was going to be extremely difficult to take.
He watched Richard Ewell, commanding the Second Corps, fail to order an assault on Cemetery Hill in the late afternoon. This is one of the most debated decisions in American military history. Ewell's discretionary orders to take the hill if practicable, his conclusion that it was not, the question of whether a more aggressive push in those final hours of daylight could have seized the high ground before the Federal Army fully occupied it and changed everything that followed. Military historians have argued about it for a century and a half. Fremantle, watching from a distance, wrote almost nothing about it, but his silence is its own form of comment. A Coldstream Guards officer watching an army let the high ground go because the commanding general wasn't sure the assault was practicable would have had opinions. What he wrote instead was about the landscape, the peculiar beauty of the Pennsylvania countryside in the summer twilight, the way the smoke from the day's fighting hung in the low places between the ridges, the distant sound of the Federal Army consolidating its position on the hills to the south. He wrote about the dead horses on the Chambersburg Pike. He wrote about a Confederate soldier he passed who was sitting against a fence post eating hard bread with the focused concentration of a man who has decided that nothing outside the circumference of what he can immediately control deserves any of his attention. He wrote about Lee. Fremantle had developed something close to reverence for Robert E. Lee over the weeks he had spent with the Army. He had met him first in camp, had been struck by the physical presence of the man, the silver hair, the extraordinary dignity, the quality of self-possession that Lee projected so completely that it seemed less like a personality trait and more like a natural phenomenon, like the gravity of a planet. He wrote about Lee the way Englishmen of his class and generation wrote about the figures they had decided were truly great, with a kind of hushed, almost religious admiration that was, when you examined it, partly about the man and partly about their own need for the idea of greatness to exist. On the evening of July 1st, Fremantle was close enough to Lee's command position on Seminary Ridge to observe him, though not to hear what he was saying. And what he observed was a general surveying the field of a day's fighting that had gone far better than it had any right to go. The Confederate Army had seized the initiative, pushed the Federal Army through a town, captured thousands of prisoners, taken the ridges north and west of Gettysburg, while simultaneously coming to terms with the fact that the enemy was now on the best ground on the battlefield. Lee sent a message to Ewell.
The Union forces on Cemetery Hill were to be attacked if at all possible. Ewell decided it was not possible. The sun went down. Both armies spent the night preparing for what was coming, and what was coming was 2 more days of fighting that would define the shape of the war that followed and the nation that eventually emerged from it. What Fremantle thought, really thought, beneath the professional assessment and the aristocratic composure, can only be reconstructed from the fragments he left. He was not a man given to unguarded expression. His diary is a remarkable document precisely because it is so controlled, and the places where the control slips are consequently more revealing than anything he wrote deliberately. He thought the Confederate soldiers were extraordinary. He had never seen infantry fight with quite that combination of aggression and endurance. He thought their officers, at the regimental and brigade level, were among the finest combat leaders he had encountered anywhere. He thought James Longstreet, whom he spent the most time with, was a formidable and deeply intelligent man who was not entirely at ease with what was happening, who had, in fact, already been arguing with Lee about the wisdom of attacking rather than maneuvering, about the danger of fighting the Federal Army on ground of its own choosing with an army that was deep in enemy territory and far from its supply lines. Longstreet had wanted to swing around the Federal left, get between the Army of the Potomac and Washington, find good ground, and force Meade to attack. Lee had disagreed. The army was here, the enemy was here, and Lee, for reasons that historians still argue about, reasons that may have had as much to do with confidence born of 2 years of winning as with any specific tactical calculation, believed his men could take whatever the Union Army put in front of them. Fremantle did not insert himself into this disagreement. He was a guest, an observer, and he had the wit to understand that the generals of a foreign army do not benefit from the unsolicited tactical opinions of a visiting British officer, however distinguished. But he watched, and he understood what Longstreet understood. He understood that the Federal Army had been hurt today, but not broken. He understood that it was now on high ground with interior lines and the ability to shift troops quickly from one threatened point to another. He understood that attacking it tomorrow was going to cost something that he wasn't sure this army, brilliant as it was, led as magnificently as it was, could afford to pay.
He was right, in the way that clear-eyed observers of other people's catastrophes are always right, from their safe distance, with their clean uniforms and their passports to a neutral country and their ability to leave. There is one more thing worth saying about what Fremantle witnessed on July 1st, and it has nothing to do with tactics or terrain or the decisions of generals. It has to do with what he saw in the faces of the civilians. Gettysburg in 1863 was a town of about 2,400 people. It had a college, it had churches, a railroad depot, a carriage factory, a cemetery. It had families who had been living in south-central Pennsylvania for generations, people who had watched the war as an abstraction, something that happened elsewhere, to other people, until the 1st of July, when it happened to them. Fremantle rode through the outskirts of the town that evening, and he saw what battle does to the places that have the misfortune to be in its path. He saw a woman standing in the door of her house, watching Confederate soldiers file past with an expression he described as being beyond fear, a kind of hollow witnessing that had moved past the stage where emotion was any longer useful. He wrote about her for 2 sentences and then moved on to other observations, but he came back to her, obliquely, in the way that writers who are trying not to feel something keep circling back to the thing they're not feeling. She appears again, unnamed, unquoted, in the margins of his account of the evening, a reference so brief it could be missed, so carefully not dwelt upon, that it becomes, paradoxically, one of the most affecting things in his diary. She was just someone who lived there, just someone who had had a life in that town, and was now watching an army that was not hers and not her enemies march through the debris of a day's fighting that had deposited the dead and wounded of both sides in her neighbors' yards. She had no say in any of it.
She had no vote in the politics that had produced it, no voice in the military decisions that had aimed two enormous armies at her street, no way to communicate to the men with rifles that she had nothing to do with any of this and would prefer to be left alone. Fremantle, watching her, was watching the cost of what he had spent the day observing with professional appreciation. He was watching the thing that happens to the place where history decides to perform itself. And for a moment, just a moment, in 2 sentences of his diary, the cold eye of the trained observer became something else, became the eye of a person, became, maybe, the beginning of a doubt that a man of his background and his era and his professional formation would have found very difficult to articulate. A doubt about what all of this was for, about what glory looks like when you see it from the window of the house it's marching past. He closed his diary that night with a note about the weather. Clear, warm. He expected another hard day tomorrow. He was right about that, too. The first day of Gettysburg cost approximately 15,000 men, killed, wounded, and missing from both sides combined. In return, it produced nothing conclusive. It produced a position. It produced a stage. It set up everything that followed with a kind of terrible narrative logic, as if the battle knew what it was building toward and the men fighting it were just finding out. Fremantle would watch 2 more days of it. He would watch Pickett's charge from a tree on Seminary Ridge on the 3rd day, one of the most viscerally immediate eyewitness accounts of that attack that exists anywhere. He would watch Lee's army begin its long retreat to Virginia in a rainstorm, the wagons stretching for miles, the losses that could not be replaced already beginning their slow work of changing the arithmetic of the war. And then he would go home, back to England, back to the Guards, back to a world where the fields were not full of the dead of a nation tearing itself apart. He would publish his diary. It would be read widely, in both the North and the South, in England and across Europe, by people trying to understand what had happened in Pennsylvania in those 3 days in July. He lived until 1901. He rose to full general in the British Army. He probably never entirely resolved the complicated mixture of admiration and unease that the Army of Northern Virginia had produced in him, the experience of watching extraordinary men do extraordinary things in the service of a cause he could not defend. But on the night of July 1st, 1863, all of that was still ahead of him. He was 28 years old. He was in Pennsylvania. He had just watched 15,000 men become casualties in a battle nobody planned over a town nobody chosen. The fires of the Federal Army at Seminary Hill were visible in the darkness to the south. The Confederate camps settled into the sounds of night, the low voices, the medical wagons, the silences that fall when men who have been fighting all day finally stop. He wrote his diary entry. He went to sleep in his fence corner. Tomorrow was going to be worse.